Hey there, everybody. So, we've got another episode of Lifestyle Medicine today, but part of what I'm going to be doing with Lifestyle Medicine is something a little different. So, I'm still going to have my guests, I'm still going to be interviewing people, but some of the feedback that I've gotten from people also is that they essentially want to hear more from me, which is kind of a weird place to be. To be honest, I really enjoy highlighting and featuring people, and that's not going to stop. But at the same time, I've also gotten the guidance to maybe do some solo talks that are a podcast episode in and of themselves about a specific topic. And so I chewed on that, and I think I'm going to start doing that. So I'll say this, that these episodes are going to be peppered throughout the lifestyle medicine schedule. It's not going to be perfectly every other week. It's not going to be any kind of set exact schedule. But what's going to start to happen is you guys are going to start to see episodes like this that are also just me talking about a specific topic, and then also the interviews with my amazing guests. So that being said, there were a lot of different things to sit with today, and I thought about the wheelhouse of the things that I could talk about within my platform. But after doing a little fishing and reaching out to my network of people, the common thread that actually came back was some personal stories and things that have either personally happened to me or experiences I've had that were transformative, beneficial, and that might be relevant for people to hear. And so the first one that came to mind was the story that I have touched on in various episodes, but I've talked about it with a number of guests, but it's usually a passing story. And so I want to dedicate this episode to specifically this particular story. And what that was me reversing my impotence at 21. So before I go on with the story, I just want to say was impotent, was being the operative word, you guys. So I'm not still impotent, but at 21, this was a real thing for me. And so I'm going to lay this out and give the context and how I reversed it, and the gamut and the hoops that I had to run through to figure this out was really difficult, because at 21, as a man, to be experiencing that was the equivalent of, the Roman Empire falling. It was the worst possible thing at that stage of my life to feel and to be dealing with. And it really impacted my mental health. It really impacted my spiritual health. I felt terrible about it. It was not a good place to be. But the seeds of this were rooted in something. And I'm going to get to that, what that was. But at the time, I didn't know that. And so what was happening, just to give context, I was 21. I was in my first real romantic relationship. And while navigating that new terrain of being in a truly intimate relationship with someone and actually being in partnership and cultivating that, for whatever reason, something was happening where whenever I was about to have sex with my partner, I was about to engage with her physically, whenever that would happen, I would be overcome with this anxiety. There was almost a panic, and my body was fully ready and on point, which means basically that, to be blunt, I was able to essentially have an erection prior to sex. And then as soon as sex was on the table, where it was about to happen, my body would freeze up and I would just feel the pit of my stomach knot up, and it would just turn inward. And I was really dumbfounded by that process, because I thought, okay, my body is physically working. It's not that I'm incapable of doing this. Something is happening when the act is about to commence that's causing problems. And a lot of people will just say, well, great, that's just performance anxiety. You're just getting in your head about it and you're overthinking it. But it wasn't that. And the reason I know that is because I was going to therapy. I started to see a therapist about this very thing, and I started to attack it from all fronts. So I saw a urologist to actually get my plumbing checked to make sure everything was all right. I started seeing a regular traditional therapist where I was just talking about my problems, and they sort of had a specialty in sexual dynamics, sexuality, and just issues, sexual health. So I was doing that. I was eating really well. I was seeing a nutritionist. I was really proactive in trying to figure out what was going on. But it wasn't just performance anxiety. It was more than that, because the emotional terrain that I was embarking upon when this would happen was brutal. I would, have one of these instances happen with my then girlfriend at the time, and I would feel bad for days after, the emotional turmoil that it would put me through. And, no slam to my girlfriend at the time, but she also wasn't the most mature 21 and wasn't able to process that I was going through something emotional. She took it very personally, that it was about her, and that it was, her shortcoming, her pitfall. And understandably, we were 21. So that's that's no slam on her that she wasn't able to get to that place, but she just wasn't in that place, no matter how much I tried to explain it, because at 21, for most people, that's just not a problem. So what started to happen was, this happened for about 6 months, where it was getting chronically worse. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then there was anxiety. And then I think it actually did turn into performance anxiety, where I thought, if I'm about to potentially have sex, I know this is going to happen, and then I would psych myself out. And so this cycle just got worse. For 6 months, I was walking this path, and it just got darker and darker and darker and darker. And it was awful, to just be fully blunt. And at that time, I had been training, interesting the timing of life and how these things cross over, but I had been training with Chuck Duran out of Chico, California, in my first formal style of martial arts, which was Kuksul Do, which is sort of a derivative or offshoot of Kuksul Wan, which is the more mainstream name for it. So I was studying Kuksul Do. I was going through this hugely transformative process with training martial arts for the first time, and specifically with a teacher of Chuck's caliber, who to this day, after years of experience, I still think is the best style instructor for me, and is just an amazing practitioner of the art, truly gifted athletically, has insight, knows himself, and delivers the art in an elegant way, in a very applicable way. So I was studying the art and was being radically transformed at the physical level, for one, but the way it made me feel, the way it made my heart feel, the way it made me engage life, the way it made me look at things, it was like a spiritual B12 shot. It was remarkable to be doing that and to be studying it with Chuck. So I had been training with him for about 4 months. And I would say that I can't remember exactly the timing, I'd be butchering it, but I know the start of Kuksul training, and more or less my duration, or my this time frame of when I was having this impotence problem, they coincided. They were close. And so as I would go, my only outlet really to sort of work out this turmoil that I was going through was to train martial arts. The physicality was one of my saving graces in terms of me just keeping my sanity, because I thought, here's something that I'm relatively good at and that was good for me and I felt good about. So I stayed with it and I kept doing it. But one of the consistent threads that Chuck kept talking about during training was this idea of what you would call internal energy. And at the time, at 21, while I was always kind of into, the esoteric, and I'd always had a bent for that kind of thing, it still sort of sounded like superfluous New Age theory. But I didn't really care. I felt so good that I was just going with the notion, and I was going with the motions, and I wasn't really challenging it too much. But he was always talking about internal energy, the relationship between intent, where what the Chinese, I found out later, call yi, our focus. Where that goes directs our chi. In Korean, they call it gi. In Japanese, they call it ki. But your bioelectric current, how much of your bioelectricity is funneled to an area, depends on where you focus. Like where your focused mind goes, your chi or your ki or your gi goes to. It's a basic idea in Chinese medicine. Very true in martial arts, true with things in life as well, right? What we focus on, we sort of gravitate and move towards. So this idea, and he would talk about this, and he was always talking about the relationship between breathing and how well our chi flowed, how well our bioelectric current moves through our body, depending on how well we breathe. And so he was always dropping these little tidbits of information about breathing, internal energy, body mechanics, and he would talk about the emotions too. And it was always sort of a side tangent or a side comment, but it was enough that it got a hold of me, and it planted a seed. And so after I had seen the urologist, after I'd been going to counseling, after I'd been doing everything, after I'd been taking every herb, horny goatweed, Damiana, everything that I could read about to try to fix this problem, I was at my wit's end, and I was about to throw in the towel. I was just not, and I don't mean suicide or anything like that, but I was just about to give up, and I was about to end the relationship because I thought, I'm not able to deal with this right now, and it's not really fair to put my partner through this, and I'm just a mess. Apparently, something's up. So I end up going to Chuck, and one night after training, I said, look, I'm really struggling with something, and I know we've only known each other for a few months, but I'm struggling with sexual performance anxiety, and I'm not always impotent, but at the moment it counts, when I'm about to have sex with my partner, I can't perform, and I'm being overridden with this feeling of anxiety and despair and sort of a grief. Like, it just feels terrible, and it's like this pit, this heavy black hole of a rock lodges into my stomach, and I freeze up. And he, without batting an eye, just listened to me. He said, okay. He said, well, thanks for telling me. And he said, well, I have a question for you. And he says, just tell me if you can feel this. And so he put his hand on my chest. He turned his hand sideways like this for the people that are watching, and he put his hand very gently onto my chest. And when he did that, it's one of those experiences that I look back and I question it now. Like, did I really feel that? But I know that I did, because it stayed with me. And what it felt like a very gentle, warm water came out of his hand, and it kind of flowed down and moved towards my belly. It was a subtle sensation, but definitely palpable. I felt it, and it was real in the moment. And I said, yeah. And I said, yeah, I felt something go down to my stomach. And he just sort of nodded and said, okay, come back. Let's give you a treatment Wednesday night. At the time, that was the longest night of training too. I think that was I can't remember, 2 or 2.5 hours that we would train, compared to the 90 minutes that we would typically train. It was a longer. Wednesday nights were like an extra long class. So he said, after that night, come back and we'll work on you. So that coming Wednesday, I did the training, worked out very hard, was very sweaty. Everybody left, and he said, okay, let's get you on the table, and let's check you out. So he lays me on the table, and the first thing he does is he doesn't touch my body. He takes his hand and he scans over my body. He lays down and he just kind of maybe 3 to 5 inches over my body, and he just scanned all over like he was attempting to feel something. And so I laid there. He went over this various aspects of my body, and he got to my left hip. And right above my left hip, sort of, if people that are hip to anatomy, the iliac crest, the top of the hip bone, basically, if you were to move inward towards my belly button, maybe 3 inches, it was right about there. And he put his hand over there, and he kind of poked and prodded a little bit in the area, and then he just really honed in on this one spot, and he dug his fingers in very slowly. And when he dug his fingers in, my whole body started to seize. And I don't mean convulsing violently, but I actually started to get tense, and my body was guarding. In the same way that if someone presses on an area that you don't like, your body sort of tenses up to defend it or to push away. I was doing that, and he said, does this physically hurt? And I said, no. I said, it's very strange. It doesn't physically hurt, but it makes me really uncomfortable. And he said, okay. And he just stayed with that pressure. He didn't move. And as he held it, my body and my anxiety started to ratchet up. It started to just elevate and get higher and stronger and deeper. And I started to just feel something welling up inside of me, and I didn't like it. It didn't feel good. And then he dug in firm. Right about that time, he dug in firm, not to the point of causing physical injury or bruising, but firm enough I remember thinking, I was like, that's the penetration or the grip of a martial artist. Like there was a martial intent behind it. There was something, I don't want to say aggressive because that's not the right word for it, but it was definitely had intention. It had a very real focus. And when he dug in, I felt it. And then my body started to shake. And I don't mean shake in the sense that I was convulsing, like big movements. My body, the best way I can describe it, because I've only felt it twice in my life, and both times were under the hands of Chuck Duran. But that first time, what it felt like, the best way I can describe it is if you've ever heard a bee fly by your head, the bzzz, that buzzing, or a bumblebee, there's a very real buzzing quality. It felt like the entire surface of my skin started to buzz. And actually just under the surface, like there were, 50,000 bees under my skin, and it started to buzz. And it did feel electrical. It felt like I had been plugged into a current a little bit, and I could hear it in my ears. It was a bzzz, and it was just making this noise, and it was very strange. I thought, what in the hell is this? This is a sensation unlike anything I've ever felt. And I'm a pretty body sensitive guy. I mean, I do body work. I move my body. I'm athletic. Not a super athlete by any means, but definitely coordinated. And I'm hip to my body. I know its rhythms. I know its movements. I know its capacities. I know how far I can push it. And I had not felt anything like this. And then as he held it, that vibration got stronger and stronger. And then I started to bawl hysterically. And I started, in the words of Larissa Conte, who was on my podcast before talking about grief rituals, she said there's a difference between crying and wailing. And what I proceeded to do was wail. And the sounds I was making were just, I remember thinking I was almost embarrassed by the noises I was making because I was sobbing and it was uncontrollable. And I was letting out these big moans, and I just could not stop crying. And he held that point very tightly while I was going through this. And then at the breaking point where I thought I couldn't take any more, I'll never forget this. He was digging, and then he slid his hands really quickly. Like it was like he had gripped something, and it felt like he kind of threw something out of my body. But it was a fast movement, just quick as hell. And when he did that, I felt the bottom of my feet get kind of sweaty. And it wasn't, it wasn't like they were soaked, but I felt the moisture in my feet kind of kick up. And then I still cried, and the buzzing was still happening. And then he just put a blanket over me. He turned the lights down, and he let me cry there for about 45 minutes. He just went into his office. He left me in this giant dojo with dim lights. And I just sat there in that warehouse of a dojo that he had, which was so cool. And I just cried and cried and cried. And as I was going through that, I remember just having all of these emotions kick up and all of these things and these ideas run through my head. And then after I stopped crying and there was sort of a lull in the storm, he walked out. He sat next to me and put his hand on my leg while I was still, sort of kind of coming to and still kind of sniffling. And he said to me, look, he said, crying like this doesn't, I get choked up even thinking about it. He said, it doesn't make you less of a man. It makes you more of one. And he said, it requires a lot as a man to go into this terrain, to cry. And when we started to talk about it, the thing that came up, and I had mentioned to him, but I had glossed over and sort of forgotten, was that my dad had died 2 years prior. I was 21. My dad had died when I was 19. And my dad died in a really brutal car accident. It was a really ugly car accident. There was a lot of carnage and a lot of violence in the actual accident. My dad was driving in the fast lane on I-5 on April 27th, 2001. He was driving in his black Porsche Boxster heading to work in the fast lane, doing about 80, which sounded like about my dad driving a Porsche. And he was driving in the fast lane, and a semi-truck on the opposite side of the road changed lanes and accidentally ran into an Acura Integra. And as that happened, the semi started to fishtail, it lost control. It ended up crashing through and over the center median into oncoming traffic. My dad happened to be the first car right there. And as my dad hit the side of that semi, there was a second semi behind my dad that essentially squashed him from the front and back. He hit the front of this one semi, and then the semi behind him caught him in the center, and it just completely crunched the entire left front side of my dad's Porsche, spun him out. So I'm just giving little side details to this story because this all kind of ties into it. These are part of the emotional themes of what I was struggling with. I struggled with the carnage, the idea of how violently my dad had died. And so in this accident, my dad dies instantly, which was the blessing. He went out quickly. They said he probably never knew what hit him. It was just too fast. It happened all too fast. Traffic backed up for 8 hours, 14-car pileup. My dad was the only person who died. So when we started to talk, I had told Chuck this in passing, and I just had not connected the dots. But I had told him that since my dad died, I had only cried twice. The day I found out, I cried. I found out from my mom when I was in my dorm. I looked in the mirror, and the look on my face, I'll never forget. It was like someone I didn't know, but I just cried for about 15 seconds, and then it just stopped. I mean, it was like a goddamn switch, and that was the strangest thing, to have my emotions completely shut off from hearing that news. And I thought, why am I not crying? That's weird. But I just stopped. Then a week later, I eulogized my dad. I was 19. He had over 700 people show up to his celebration of life, which was incredible. And I eulogized him. And that night, when I went to bed, I cried for about 20 minutes. After that, 2 years straight, no tears. No processing, no crying. And so when I was talking to Chuck about this, as we started to kind of open up this dialogue after the treatment, he said, look, Gray, he said, to lose a father, someone that you were close to, someone that you loved, someone you got along with. We had our issues, but collectively he was a wonderful man. I loved him to death. And he said, when you lose somebody like that, when that happens, he says the emotion has to be processed. And if you don't process it, it's just a matter of time before it finds you. And he said, we all store it in somewhere in the body. Sometimes it's into an organ. Sometimes it's into a joint. You were storing that there. He's like, I've worked on enough bodies to know what that feels like. And he said, that left untouched for 30, 40 years, that event, that emotion, which is, quote unquote, energy in motion, emotion, he said that will essentially stagnate into an area of the body, an area that the body has felt safe to compartmentalize it in. He says, and then over time, if it is not addressed, that energy will eventually materialize, maybe into a cyst, maybe into a tumor, maybe into a cancer, maybe into some larger problem. But eventually, that energy, that emotion will become material. And that's what we call disease. And he said that's a part of it. That's, sometimes it's environmental toxins, sometimes it's whatever, but it can be emotional toxicity or not processing our emotions. And so we talked for about another 45 minutes, and he just very lovingly became sort of a father figure for me. I mean, in that motion where he was saying, like, it's okay to cry. It's okay to process this stuff and to feel it and to fully surrender to it and to let it crush you, because if you don't, it's going to bite you later. And he said, I'm really proud of you for saying something to me, for coming to me, and, you're on your way, and, keep your head up and your heart open. And it was one of the most loving, compassionate, transformational, and powerful experiences I've ever had in my life. At 21, to have that happen and to have someone step in to my life after losing my father and to meet me with that heart and those words forever changed me. And to this day, I'm eternally grateful. So Chuck, if you're listening, I love you. And thank you so much for being that person and for helping me. And so when I went through this, heard about it, heard about the dialogue from Chuck about, my dad, and it really felt true as I was talking about it. I thought, God, there's this grief that I haven't touched. I haven't explored. I haven't processed. I haven't been proactive in digesting it. I didn't know I even needed to. I thought I could just sort of suppress it and move on. So treatment wraps up. He gives me a hug. My girlfriend at the time was living in Sacramento. And so that night, for the first time, I just felt good. I felt like this big load off had been taken off of me. And I drove to Sacramento, and for the first time I thought, I don't even give a shit if we have sex. I just want to see my girlfriend, and I just want to say hi to her. And I just want to do that. Like, I just want to go. And so I drove on a Wednesday night from Chico. I had class the next day at like 2. But drive to Sacramento. We go have a nice dinner. And for whatever reason, she was kind of in the same spot. She sadly, she had sort of given up and been like, yeah, my boyfriend's just kind of impotent at the moment, so I'm just going to forego the sexual activity and I'm just going to enjoy his company. I have no idea how she got there or why that night, but we were both in the same space. I'm like, yeah, whatever. Great. We go have a nice dinner, great conversation. We go back to her place, and I give her a hug, and, long story short, I don't want to get into too many details, but the bottom line was that I started to feel sexual vitality kind of pumping through me, and we started to get physical, and sure enough, I was able to perform for the first time in 6 months. And not just perform, but I mean, I was on point. Let's just say everything was working fully. And I remember, we were sitting there laying afterwards, and, she said, I'll never forget this. She says, did you take like the little blue pill? Did you take Viagra? Did you take a pill to fix this? And I said, no. She's like, so what happened? Because this gray has not been here for about 6 months. So what happened? And I said, I cried. I fucking cried really hard earlier tonight. And I unearthed the grief I had been sitting on around my dad's death that I hadn't processed. She didn't take that too well, God love her. But she was like, huh, okay. But I mean, she just was not of that attitude or mindset. And moreover, she hadn't had the experience. So it was very difficult for her to plug into at 21. No slam on her. Again, it was just where she was. But she heard it and was like, okay, cool. Whatever. If it works, it works. And so it opened up this door. That experience, from that point forward, I didn't have a problem with impotence anymore after that. I had one spell come up later, about 2 years later, but I kind of knew the mechanism, and really what it boiled down to, it wasn't about my dad, but it was about repressed emotion. And when I would get in touch with my emotion and I would cry, this issue would go away from me. And I think this is a really important thing to talk about, because some men go through some kind of erectile dysfunction throughout their life, especially as men get older and testosterone levels drop. It's going to happen. Some of us, it's happened because of anxiety. Some of it's happened because of like diet, stressors that we're going through. But sometimes it's emotional. And for me, it was emotional. And that's where it manifested. And we all process our grief differently. We all compartmentalize our emotions differently. For me, it just so happened that when I compartmentalized my grief and I repressed my grief and my pain around my dad, where it manifested was sexual anxiety and impotence. That's me. For other people, it's different. They might have chronic migraines. I mean, the body is a very complex system, and we all have different strengths and deficiencies. So our body is going to try to protect itself in different ways, as does the mind. And I think it's a really important thing for men to consider. And I think for people in general to think about that, if we have a stasis in emotion and we're not processing the difficult things that come down the pike, we can really encounter some very gnarly physical manifestations. And this was mine. And outside of that, the light at the end of this tunnel was that in going through that experience and seeing a urologist, seeing a psychologist, seeing an herbalist, trying all of these things, and then to have the solution be so fucking simple that I just had to cry to remedy my impotence, blew my mind. To this day, it still blows my mind. I thought, how could I have gone through all of this stuff and the solution was so simple? Just feel. Feel the pain. And the life gates open. So when that happened, I from that point forward, for one, I listened to Chuck a lot more in the context of training. His tutelage and his approach to teaching, I was wide open now. My ears were open. I was hip to it. I was like, okay, homeboy knows some shit, and I'm going to listen to him. Doesn't mean he's a god. Doesn't mean he's infallible. Doesn't mean that he's perfect, because he's not. Like any person, he's got his flaws, just like me and everyone else. But I was listening. It validated the efficacy of his approach and his medicine. And so I listened to him, and the martial arts got deeper, and I had a better dialogue with martial art training as a result of that. And it also planted the seed for the very path that I am walking today. That experience opened my mind, and I had direct, palpable experience with the relationship between the mind, body, and emotions, and how those things relate and how they connect in real time. If I hadn't had that experience with Chuck, I would have never known that emotions can have such a demonstrable effect on the physical. And up till that point, it had been New Age fluff. It had been New Age theory for me. It was like, yeah, emotions, okay, mind and body. It's a cool theory, and I think there's some merit to it, but I hadn't have it impact me so heavily, and then to have someone essentially come in and press the button and fix it. So it put me on the path. It always opened the dialogue between the mind-body connection from that point forward, and that's what put me on the map. That's what I thought, I'm really intrigued by this concept, and it changed how I approached everything from that point forward. In terms of diet, friendships, partners, everything was different as a result of that, and it did lead me to the healing arts. I mean, that experience got me into Chinese medicine, or it was a driving force, a very strong driving force, and to stick with this, because that one experience where I had an emotional release and have, impotence reversed, it's fucking mind-boggling. I mean, straight up, it's just mind-boggling. And I think it's a story I like telling. I have the deepest and utmost respect and reverence for Chuck Duran. And I also think it's really important for people to consider it, because sometimes I think a story is more personal than theory. That's true in my life. It's true in a lot of people's life. But I'm always saying that experience trumps dogma and theory. And up till this point, this idea was dogma and theory. But then I had a direct experience, and it forever changed me, and it put me onto the path I am today. And I have, I haven't looked back. I've loved where I am. It's been difficult, but it's been a really cool path, and it wouldn't have happened if I had not had that experience. So for today, that is the solo episode of me talking about how I reversed my impotence at 21 through crying. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you guys got some value out of it, and I will see you next time. Thanks a bunch.